Hey, I'm ZSH Plays, welcome back to San Bernardino Zoo, and welcome to the final build in our African section. Yes, it's time for the king of the beasts to move in, and they're going to be moving in right here next to the exit building that we built last week. I know you guys have been waiting for lions for a very long time. I am really excited to start building this one, so let's go. This is the first lion habitat I've ever designed. Can't wait to get started on it. There is loads of different ways that we could go in terms of the design for this habitat, but one thing that links together most of my favourite lion habitats that I've seen in real zoos is using a moat to separate the lions from the guests. There's just something about there being just a body of water between you and lions that is so cool. It's definitely my favourite way of showing them. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to raise the land here, and then to the right hand side of the path is going to be just a moat. And that will be all that separates the guests from the lions, apart from a little fence that you can look over. And I think that's going to be really effective. I've seen that in London Zoo when I was a kid, in Artis in the Netherlands, in Singapore Zoo. It's just such a great way to display them, and that's what we're going to do here. Now, the initial inspiration for this habitat might be London Zoo, but the actual layout we're going to be using is directly based on Singapore Zoo. I took a load of video and photos of, well, pretty much all the habitats when I was there, and the lions is no exception. So I've got really good reference for their lion habitat, and this is what we're going to be using here. So we're going to put a gradual slope in here so that it goes from the edge of the water upwards, and there's going to be 3 levels of terrain in this habitat to make it look really interesting and give a lot of different pathways that the lions can use to stop any stereotypical behavior developing. We're going to be using 3 different types of barrier to build this habitat. These glass barriers at the front will be hidden and will be purely used to keep the water where we want it to be. We're also going to have knoll barriers in parts and then concrete barriers at the back. Very rare that I use concrete barriers in this game, but they're going to work really nicely for this habitat because they're going to be completely covered up with foliage, but you'll just have that little bit of texture poking through here and there, which is going to look really realistic. The moat needs to be 7 meters wide. That's just a little further than lions can jump, and we'll make sure that they don't get out of the habitat, which would be a disaster, of course. And then what we're going to do is dig out the terrain here so that we can get our moat in. This needs to be fairly deep. Lions do not like swimming, but they can swim. So it needs to be deep enough that they can't get any purchase on the bottom and then jump out the other side. And doing it that way means that we don't need to have the wall for the guests to be particularly tall, because once they're in the water, if they can't touch the bottom and they can't climb the guest side of the wall, then we can safely contain them. Alright, that's the water in. We've got a nice natural looking curve on the edge of the land there. What we're going to do now is drop down these glass barriers as low as we can get them and then put the water back, and they'll be covered up later on. Now we're going to start working on the different levels of terrain here. We're using the flatten to surface brush, which works great for this. Probably the hardest tool in the game to get used to, I think, but eventually when you get used to it, you can do some really cool stuff with it like this. And this is probably the most terrain work I've ever done in a habitat, I think, by the time we're finished with this one. It was definitely the weakest part of my Planet Zoo skill set when I started this series, but we've had a lot of practice since then. I think I'm definitely a lot better at it than I used to. So we're going to do a hell of a lot of terrain work in this habitat and get these 3 levels going to get something really visually interesting for the guests and stimulating for the lions. And while I finish off the terrain work, let's talk about the lions and their requirements. So this habitat, like all the habitats in the zoo, will meet the game's minimum requirements for their space needs and also the American Zoo Association's minimum requirements as well. We're going to have 3 lions in here and room for a couple of cubs as well. And if it's not looking that big to you, this staff path that's currently running up the side of the habitat is going to be deleted, and a shelter will be going in to some of that space, which makes the overall size of the habitat bigger. I don't think lions actually need that much space. If you've ever seen them in a zoo, or if you've been lucky enough to see them in the wild, they are pretty much the laziest animals on the planet. I think they spend about 23 hours a day snoozing, and the females then spend 1 hour a day hunting, and the males don't even bother doing that. They just wait for the females to succeed and then saunter over and help themselves. They don't need as much space as an animal of that size would suggest. I've visited a lot of zoos that hold lions. I've seen them in some fairly small habitats, and I've seen them in the enormous set of fields they have at Yorkshire Wildlife Park. And the one thing all those visits had in common is that you very, very rarely see the lions moving, no matter how much space they've got. Back to the build, one of the most important parts is this joining the water onto the land. I want to make this really realistic. Now at Singapore Zoo, it looks like the water joins directly onto the land. It just goes from grass to a little bit of soil to the water. That can't be what they've done, because the soil would just erode into the water. It would get wet. It just wouldn't stay there. So I think what they've done is use brown concrete or cement, just a very thin layer of that to line the moat. and then that also acts as a barrier to keep the actual real soil and grass behind it. So we're going to replicate that here using the tropical rocks because they're brown and they'll meld in really nicely to the dirt once we get the terrain painting right, and we can get the grass to come right up to this by using the buffalo grass, which we'll do in a second, and that should replicate the look of the real habitats very effectively, I think. This was possibly the fiddliest part of the whole habitat. I didn't think it would take this long, but getting the rocks to line up exactly with the shoreline, so to speak, and making it look seamless and realistic was pretty tricky. But as you can see when we get the camera down to there, you really get this subtle line between the water and the land that is exactly what I was going for, so it was worth spending the time on it. So I'll cut most of that out for your sake, and here we are at the end. It's all done now. And once we get rid of all the grass that's touching it and get some soil in there, it's going to be a really seamless transition. Next thing we're going to build is some shelters for the lions. This is taken directly from Singapore Zoo. Really cool. Lots of zoos do this. You build a sort of rock shelter that the lions can go under, and you bury that into a rise in the terrain behind it so that the lions can also stand on top of the shelter. You get some really cool sort of Lion King style views of the lions up on a rock, and you give the lions somewhere to get out of the sun or get a bit of privacy from the guests. Really standard feature of lion habitats, these, and it was a lot of fun making one. That's the main reason for the rise in the terrain behind it. Unfortunately, this being Planet Zoo, there's no way the lions are actually going to fit in here because the hitboxes are too big, but I'm hoping once we've got cubs that the cubs will be able to get into here. We shall see. We don't have any yet. I'll put some of the sleeping hay in here to encourage them to come in here to sleep, and hopefully once we've got some cubs we can see these in action. But we're going to put the terrain up behind them so that the lions will be able to get up on top of these and stand there looking very impressive. You'll see that in the cinematics at the end. I'm using the savanna rocks to try and get more of an African feel in here. So the habitat I'm basing this on is for Asiatic lions, and it's in an Asian zoo in Singapore. This is for African lions, and it's in a zoo in America. So obviously changes need to be made to fit the theming. We'll use some of these rocks and then some of the more standard grey rocks as well later on in the build to get a bit of variety in there. But these platforms I wanted to have a fairly African kind of look, using as few different rocks as possible and just using random rotation to make them individual. And it's all just about spinning and spinning and spinning until you're happy with the way it looks, getting in exactly the right place to get the effect that you want, and making sure there's no repeating patterns. Now, I said at the start that this is the last habitat in Africa, so it's probably a good time to talk about the future plans for the zoo. So next week we will be taking a tour of the finished African area. I've got a couple of tiny little bits that I want to add in and make sure all the paths and everything else is looking absolutely perfect before we do that. So that'll be the biggest tour of the zoo we've done so far, with this being by far the biggest area. From an aerial view, this is actually bigger than Australia and the islands combined now, the African area. It's a lot bigger than I envisioned it when I started. And next week's episode will be the final episode in season 2 of San Bernardino Zoo before we start the third and final season. I got quite a few worried comments last week thinking that because we'd built the exit to the zoo that was the end of the zoo. Do not worry, there are 2 massive chunks of land either side of Africa that are empty at the moment, and they are all going to be filled before this zoo is finished. I'll tell you more about the plans for season 3 next week, but really looking forward to filming the tour and showing this area off in all its glory. There's going to be loads of things that you haven't seen and loads of things that have been improved since those habitats were made, but we'll check all of that out next week. Back to the build. This is the final piece of terrain work that we're going to be doing, bringing the terrain up to the level of the top of this shelter so that the lions can walk up here and stand on top of the rocks, and then we'll do a bit of terrain painting and get some sand into the bottom part here, and then some dirt to join the grass onto the sand. It's always important to have transitions between different types of terrain. It just makes it look much more realistic. Get a little bit more sand in there, and then we'll put in some of the hay that I spoke about. Hopefully we'll get the cubs sleeping in here, and then we're going to copy this across to the other side. We don't want just one shade shelter. Might lead to arguments around the lions, and you really don't want lions arguing if you can help it. So we'll get that one over there. And then we're going to put in some of the piñatas. We got the zebra ones. Finally, we've got a piñata that's actually the right prey item for the animal that we're using. That's really cool. And then we'll put some more of the enrichment items in as well. Want some of the rubbing bark on this log here. We'll use the path trick so that we can just put that down without deforming the terrain. And then we'll start with the terrain painting. This is a vital part of any build, but it's especially vital in this build because we don't have a cool piece of architecture at the back or climbing frames everywhere or a big jungle or anything. It's mainly just grass and a few rocks, so we really need to get this right. So what I'm doing is copying exactly the places where the grass had been reduced to dirt in the real habitat, just using both the dirt textures, and later on I'm going to show you a trick which will really bring the realism in any grass-based habitat that you've got. But before that, we're going to drop in a few more of these rocks. These are the grey ones that I spoke about before, to get a bit more interest into the habitat, and again, just to replicate what I saw in Singapore. And then we're going to move on to the grass. This is really important here. I'm not going to use any of the long grass that the game provides us with. We're going to use the buffalo grass and use all 3 different sizes of it to really fill in all the parts where we want grass. And as in real life, we'll have slightly more grass around the edges of rocks and things like that, and then less grass in the areas that are going to be more well-traveled by the lions. That's another way to make things look more realistic. Think about how long or how trampled the grass is going to be in various different places. So we're going to put some around these rocks here, maybe a little longer, and then in the main body of the habitat we'll have it shorter. One of the issues with having loads of terrain changes in a habitat like this is it makes putting the grass in take ages, because you've basically got to place each bit manually, or you're going to end up with grass floating in midair or grass that's completely underground so you can't see it. I like to just put it in and then we can select it all and get it to exactly the right height like that. You can see here that's starting to look really nice. The one thing I don't like about it is the fact that it is so green, it's almost neon. There is a way to fix it, and that means it's time for Franchise Masters. This grass is way too green for Southern California, so what we're going to do is take the dirt texture, turn the intensity all the way down to 10%, get a nice big brush, and then just hold the mouse button down over each section of it and watch it slowly fade away from almost neon green down to a much more subtle color. And you just do this over the whole habitat until you get the color that you want. If you go too far, don't worry, you can just undo. But this really sits this in and makes it look much more realistic. If it was an English meadow after some summer rain, maybe it would be this green, but you're never going to see grass like this in Southern California in the middle of a lion habitat. So we just do that all over and get a much more realistic grass color. I hope you find that useful in your zoos. Let's get back to the build. Time for some plants. So the real habitat in Singapore had some interesting plants in it, which I've seen in real life, but I have no idea what they're called. We don't seem to have them in the game, but the elephant grass does a pretty decent job of replicating them. Once we sink them down into the ground, we just get these sort of clusters of fairly thin leaves coming out, which brings to mind what I saw in Singapore. And then we're going to put one tree in the middle of the habitat, and then we're going to start covering up the concrete barriers. So we don't have any bushes, but this tree does a really good job. I think it's the fig tree, does a really good job of replicating what I saw there. Obviously we don't want any actual trees next to the barriers, because the lions can just climb them and jump out. So we want big sort of shrubs all the way around it, and this tree does a great job of looking like one of those. So we'll just get loads of these in, all randomly rotated and moved so that they cover up the concrete. But I really like the way that you can just get a little bit of the concrete poking through. That looks great. We'll sort out the guest side of things now. So we're going to put these rocks in to stop the lions from climbing out, and we'll put some smooth concrete over the bottom of it so it's not climbable. And then we're going to reuse the elephant fence on this side of it. Like how this looks, we'll make it a bit lower, and then just copy this across the whole front of the path here. And then we'll get really, really good viewing for the guests, which is the sort of the whole point of this habitat. This was the thing I wanted to replicate most, so you just get this completely unobstructed view of the lions. This is why we lowered the glass barriers earlier, because you can see once we put this in, then you can't see the glass barriers at all. They're completely covered up. And let's move on to the final stage of the build now, which is putting in the lion's shelter. The idea for this shelter is that it'll be almost completely hidden from the guests, so no need to go crazy with the build. What we're going to do is use the generic shelter that we originally built for the hippos, and just resize this so that it fits nicely into the lion habitat. I built this on the grid, so it's really easy to customize it to any size that you want. Once you've got the basics of it in and got one piece of it in the right position, like so, then you can just copy it really simply to fill in the space that you want. And you can actually form both sides of the building just by rotating one of these pieces and copying it across the other axis. We're going to use some plaster panels to get the habitat gate situated nicely into the building, so it's not just hidden by the wall. You can actually see it, and it can actually open and close when the staff go in there. And then the last thing that we're going to do is just put some plants over the walls so that it sits in nicely and isn't too much of an eyesore at the back of the habitat. And we'll also place some of the stacked rocks that we built for the elephants on the roof to further make it look natural and hide the harsh outline of this rectangular building. And that is the lion habitat complete. Let's check it out. There's the finished shelter. Looks a lot better with that roof on it, I think, and some more bushes in front of it. And here's our first lion stepping into the habitat. It's so cool to finally have these animals in the zoo. It's been a long time coming. Our new gift shop makes a really cool backdrop to the habitat as well. You can just see it peeking out over the top there. I'm very, very pleased with how the habitat looks. Especially this view here. This really brings to mind what I saw in Singapore, just with a more African flavour. and they look amazing up on top of these shelters on the rocks as well. The habitat may not be the biggest, but they've still got room to run around. The females look absolutely amazing. I know the male lion in this game gets a lot of flack. Personally, I think it's a really good model. It's just not a particularly realistic one. But I think the female lions are one of the best models in the game. They've really captured their look perfectly. Let's take a look at where we started today, and this is where we are now. That is Africa complete, apart from a few little touch-ups that I need to do, which I will get on with this week. And next week we will go in and explore the whole thing. Here's the Explorers Club monolith. Thank you so much to all of you who have joined. We've just hit 50 members of the Explorers Club, which is absolutely amazing. Hit the join button on the channel if you want to see your name in the zoo. And I'll see you again next week for the Africa tour. Thanks for watching. Bye.